Welcome back to our verse-by-verse and now thematic journey through the book of Proverbs. I'm Pastor Lance, and this is episode 11. In our last episode, we looked at what Proverbs has to say about parenting, the long game of forming a child into an adult, the compounding effect of faithful investment across generations, and the collision between a biblical vision of child raising and the one that our culture has handed to us. We closed with a promise to return to the subjects of correction and discipline, because Proverbs has quite a bit to say about them. Most of it runs directly against the grain of contemporary wisdom. These are important subjects wrapped around the core of the wisdom that Proverbs promotes. And so I don't want to rush through them. We'll take a look at correction in this episode and then discipline in the next. As we dive into the subject of correction now, please bear in mind that as a parent, we dole it out to our children. But as human beings, we also ought to receive correction. Part of good parenting is training our children from a young age to take correction, to welcome it rather than to dread it. And of course, we can go far in doing that as parents by being teachable ourselves and responding graciously when we are corrected. In 1972, the American psychologist Martin Seligman, he published a study that became one of the most cited pieces of research in behavioral psychology. It wasn't about children, it was about dogs, believe it or not. Seligman exposed dogs to mild electric shocks that they could escape by pressing a lever. The dogs quickly learned to press the lever. Okay, so far, should be pretty obvious, right? Then he placed the same dogs in a situation where no lever was available, where the shocks were unavoidable, and after a while he returned to the lever. Now the dogs, who previously had learned to escape, now just sat there. They'd been conditioned to believe that their actions had no effect on their circumstances. Seligman called it learned helplessness. The application to parenting and to discipline is profound. When children never experience the connection between behavior and consequence, they develop their own version of learned helplessness. They grow up believing the universe is just arbitrary, that nothing they do really matters, that outcomes are divorced from choices. That's not wisdom. That's, in the language of Proverbs, that's foolishness. Correction and discipline are how a parent teaches a child that the world isn't arbitrary. Choices have consequences. Wisdom has rewards. Foolishness has costs. Learning that lesson at 3, at the kitchen or the dinner table, is vastly preferable to learning it at 30 in front of a judge. That's what Solomon understood, and that's what we're going to unpack today. Our first proverb on correction is Proverbs 13:14, which says, "The law of the wise is a fountain of life, to turn one away from the snares of death." So Solomon opens this theme with what would have been for that time a vivid image, a fountain. To hear it in the way that his original readers did, please don't think of a decorative fountain, in a city park with pennies on the bottom of it, pigeons around the edge. No, in the ancient Near East, a fountain was a thing found in nature. It was natural. Water trapped underground was pulled downhill by gravity until it found an outlet, and then typically it would burst into the open air, nourishing everything downstream. The economy of the ancient world was agricultural, which means water was everything to them. Land near a natural fountain was prime real estate. It was the beginning of rivers, the source of fertility. It was the engine of prosperity. What a water fountain was to physical prosperity, the counsel of the wise is to spiritual well-being. Heeding wise correction alters our path and keeps us out of trouble, which Solomon calls a snare here. The word picture that he draws is a trap set for birds, designed to catch them by the foot before they know they're even in danger. Proverbs doesn't say that wisdom eliminates all danger. It says wisdom will keep you from the traps that you don't see coming. Precisely what correction aims for. It's a wise voice saying, hey, the path that you're on leads somewhere you don't want to go. Psalm 139 verse 16 sets it in a larger frame when we read, "In your book they all were written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them." Each of us has an appointed number of years. We can't outlive our appointed time. Listen, we can though, by foolishness, die before that. The snare that catches us isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a pattern of choices sustained over years that quietly shortens what might have been. Proverbs 19:19 says, "A man of great wrath will suffer punishment, for if you rescue him, you'll have to do it again." This proverb reminds us that sometimes love means not helping. Solomon describes someone who's stubborn. He or she refuses correction. They think they're smarter than everyone around them. They reject advice and they repeat the same mistakes again and again. They want what they want and they're not about to let reality keep it from them. Now, Solomon's counsel for that kind of person is, don't rescue them. Now, let's be careful here. The Bible is full of calls to help the suffering and bear one another's burdens. This isn't a license for cold indifference. It's a recognition that some people only learn from consequences and that removing those consequences is really just cruelty dressed up as kindness. There's a term in addiction recovery for this. It's called enabling. The spouse who bails the alcoholic out of every legal entanglement, the parent who pays every debt their adult child incurs through recklessness, they believe that they're helping. What they're actually doing is insulating the person from the one thing that might produce change, the full weight of what they've chosen. In the sometimes difficult to understand book, The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis made the argument that God could give us a world free of suffering. But it would be a world in which nothing real could be learned, in which nothing of consequence could be chosen, in which character could not be formed. God chose a better world, one in which our choices matter enough to have real costs. The same logic applies in human relationships. If you love someone enough to always rescue them, that love may in fact ruin them. Sometimes the best thing that you can do for a foolish friend or a rebellious child or a stubborn relative is to step back, pray, and let consequences of their foolishness come. Proverbs 19 verse 25 says, "Strike a scoffer, and the simple will become wary. Rebuke one who has understanding, and he will discern knowledge." Solomon identifies three types of people here. The way that each responds to correction tells you pretty much all you need to know about them. The scoffer is incorrigible. They don't learn. They've so thoroughly convinced themselves the rules don't apply to them, no amount of persuasion or rebuke or punishment is going to produce change in them. They sit inside their own imaginary invincibility. The simple are the middle group. They're open-minded, impressionable, not yet committed to wisdom or folly. When they see the scoffer punished publicly, they take note of that. They update their calculations. The simple are moved by observing consequences. But then there's the prudent, the person of understanding. They don't need to watch someone else suffer the consequences of a mistake to understand that it's just that, a mistake. A word of rebuke is enough for them because they've already oriented toward truth. For them, correction isn't humiliation, it's important information. Now we think of those very public corporate scandals. The Enron executives, the Theranos fraud, the parade of hedge fund managers who went to prison in the wake of 2008. Hundreds of smaller players saw those high-profile collapses, took careful notes, and steered clear of similar patterns. That's the simple learning from the scoffer's punishment. But the genuinely wise person, he didn't need to watch anyone go to prison. Those already knew the trajectory of the corrupt choices made years before the cell doors shut. They recognized the pattern of self-deception that leads there because they were paying attention to something deeper than consequences. They were paying attention to what's actually right and just and fair. Proverbs 25 verse 12 says, "Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise rebuker to an obedient ear." We may stop growing physically somewhere around our mid-20s, but our souls can grow for a lifetime. The catch is, growth requires acknowledging that there are thoughts and habits, blind spots, even patterns that can stand in the way of that growth. Sadly, we often can't see them on our own. We've lived with them for so long, they've just become part of the furniture of our lives. That's where a wise rebuker becomes invaluable. I'm not talking about a critic who attacks us or a flatterer who just builds us up for their own purposes. I'm talking about someone who sees what's stalling our growth and has the courage to name it, to call it out. Solomon refers to this person as gold, fine gold, an ornament, something beautiful, not something merely to be endured, but something to be treasured. In the early 1970s, I had a mouth. And one day I said something to someone that was true, but it was brutal. It was cruel. It was the kind of comment that leaves a scar. Well, a friend of mine overheard it and pulled me aside and said, "Lance, you lack tact. You need to be more careful." She was right, completely, obviously right, and I knew it. I knew it the moment she said it. It stung. Not because it was unfair, but because it was accurate. I made a real effort after that to think before I spoke. That woman's rebuke was gold. She could have said nothing. She could have laughed it off or changed the subject. But instead, she told me the truth, and her telling of it made me a better person. Every morning, I use a razor to shave. Now, on a microscopic level, that's violent. It's cutting things off. But I'm better for it. Wise rebuke is a spiritual razor. It removes what needs to go. Proverbs 28 verse 23 says, "He who rebukes a man will find more favor afterward than he who flatters with the tongue." That word afterward is doing a lot of work in that verse. In the moment, correction rarely feels like favor, doesn't it? But afterwards, once the sting has faded and the growth has happened, the person who told you the truth holds a great honor in your memory, a greater honor than those who told you only what you wanted to hear. Flattery is seductive because it doesn't cost anything. It asks nothing of the person giving it and delivers a reward to the person receiving it. A well-placed compliment can open doors. But flattery is almost always in service of something. The flatterer wants something from you, even if what they want is simply your goodwill. Anytime someone goes on and on about how great you are, be at least somewhat suspicious. They want something. Correction, on the other hand, is costly. It risks the relationship. It requires courage. And it requires the corrector to actually care about your long-term flourishing rather than just some short-term feelings. The person who tells you the truth when the truth is uncomfortable that's one of the most rare and valuable people that you will ever have for your life. One word of wise correction is worth 10 compliments. Compliments may add a little confidence to you, but the danger is inflating pride. Correction is what really makes us better. In the next study, we're going to take a look at what ought not be, but often is, controversial subject of parental discipline. Turns out Proverbs has a lot to say about it.